In the Soviet Union, turning the key to your new apartment didn't mean you were moving up in life. It meant you were moving into a Khrushchevka, a concrete box that millions would learn to call home. To understand why, we have to go back to the Soviet housing crisis. After World War II, Soviet cities were bursting at the seams. In Moscow, as late as 1954, almost a quarter of all families lived in a single room. The average living space across urban areas was just 5.6 square meters per person, barely larger than a prison cell. Families with 3 generations often squeezed into one room, cooking on portable stoves in shared hallways. Communal apartments meant dozens of strangers sharing a kitchen, a bathroom, even one gas burner. A single corridor might house 20 families. Arguments about who burned whose soup were an everyday soundtrack. When Nikita Khrushchev rose to power, he made housing his crusade. In his famous 1954 speech, he railed against the wasteful Stalinist towers, those grand wedding cake skyscrapers that defined Moscow's skyline. To Khrushchev, they were too expensive, too slow, too decadent. He wanted housing that could be built like tractors, cheap, fast, and standardized. In 1955, a decree banned decorative excesses. No more arches, mosaics, or marble facades. A second decree in 1957 demanded mass standardization. The future of Soviet housing was to be built by factories, not architects. And so came the Khrushchevka, a standardized 5-story apartment block made of precast concrete panels. Why 5? Because 6 would require elevators, and elevators cost money. The ceilings were lowered to 2.48 meters. Kitchens shrank to just 5.8 square meters. Bathrooms were often combined into one cubicle, so small that residents joked you could wash your hands while sitting on the toilet. Living rooms doubled as bedrooms. In some layouts, you literally had to pass through one bedroom to reach another. At first, the program looked unstoppable. Construction factories called DSKCs churned out prefabricated slabs. Cranes dropped them into place. In Leningrad, one construction crew set a record, a 5-story block in 5 days. Across the country, whole neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. The numbers were staggering. In 1956, the Soviet Union built about 41 million square meters of housing. By 1960, that number had doubled to 82.8 million square meters in a single year. Between 1956 and 1963, the USSR nearly doubled its housing stock, from 640 million square meters to 1.18 billion. By the mid-1960s, 1 in 4 Soviet families lived in a Khrushchevka. In total, more than 54 million people would eventually move into these blocks, and the cost was attractive to planners. A square meter in a concrete panel Khrushchevka cost about 103 to 110 rubles to build, cheaper than brick construction at 122 to 130 rubles. By 1963, nearly 200 house-building factories were operating across the Soviet Union, stamping out slabs from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. For many, moving in really was a revolution. Propaganda films showed smiling families opening their new front doors. For the first time, ordinary workers had a private bathroom, a kitchen, however tiny, that belonged to them alone. Children could sleep in their own rooms, even if those rooms doubled as corridors. Families who had lived in damp barracks or basements finally had 4 walls. Soviet citizens often said, "It may be small, but at least it's ours." But the flaws were impossible to ignore. The thin concrete walls carried every sound. One resident quipped, "We don't need a radio, we just listen to our neighbors." Another said, "We live in separate flats, but we hear everything together." Privacy was impossible. Arguments, lullabies, toilets flushing, all of it traveled freely through the panels. The small kitchens became legendary. At just over 5 square meters, there wasn't room for a table and chairs. The furniture industry was forced to adapt. Designers churned out folding tables, wall-mounted cupboards, collapsible beds. A satirical line spread, "Our kitchen is so small, when I spread butter on bread, my wife has to step outside." And the nickname soon followed. People called them Khrushchoba, a mix of Khrushchev and Khrushchoba, the Russian word for slum. The name stuck. For the state, it was still a triumph. The 1957 decree that launched the program declared housing shortages would be solved within 20 years. And by raw statistics, they had reason to boast. By the 1970s, communal apartments were no longer the majority. Millions had moved into their own flats. But the price was monotony. Walk through a Soviet micro-district and the logic becomes clear. The buildings were arranged not for beauty, but for cranes. Straight lines, parallel blocks, open lawns, nothing more. Architects complained that cities had become deserts of identical walls. Foreign visitors noticed too. In 1959, the German modernist Ernst May admired the ambition, but criticized the soul-crushing uniformity. Soviet urban historian Khan Magomedov later argued that in fighting architectural excesses, the USSR had eliminated architecture itself. Even Khrushchev admitted the blocks were temporary. Designed for 25 years of service life, they were supposed to be replaced by better housing once communism matured. That higher stage never arrived. Instead, the Khrushchevkas stayed. By 2010, millions of people were still living in them, long past their expiry date. In Russia alone, over 10% of the urban population still occupies Khrushchevkas today, the Ware shows. Studies found first-generation blocks with 40 to 60% deterioration, depending on the region. In some seismic zones, the buildings are dangerously unstable. Moscow has already demolished thousands. The city's 2017 urban renewal program targeted over 5,000 buildings, relocating about 1.6 million residents. Protesters warned that green courtyards would be bulldozed for denser towers. The cycle continues. Socialism's temporary solution has become capitalism's redevelopment headache. Elsewhere, the legacy varies. In parts of Eastern Europe, Khrushchevkas were insulated, repainted, and modernized. EU money helped turn some of them into passable, even efficient housing. In others, across Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, renovation is patchwork, left to tenants. The result is an uneven mix of brightly painted facades, decaying stairwells, and improvised fixes. Yet despite all the criticism, it's impossible to deny the social impact. By some estimates, the Khrushchevka program gave 95% of new tenants their first private apartment. That was a seismic shift in everyday life. Children had space to study without a neighbor banging on the wall. Couples had privacy for the first time. For families who had spent decades in overcrowded dormitories, even a tiny, thin-walled apartment felt like luxury. But as with everything in the Soviet Union, the achievement came at a cost. Comfort was sacrificed for speed. Quality was sacrificed for numbers. People got their apartments, but they also got cracks in the walls, rattling pipes, and ceilings low enough to make tall men hunch. They got privacy from strangers, but no privacy from neighbors. They escaped the communal nightmare, but entered a concrete one. And that's the paradox of the Khrushchevka. It was progress. Undeniable, measurable progress. But it was progress that came a size too small, a decade too temporary, and a lifetime too loud. Today, walk through a Soviet city at dusk and you'll still see them. Endless rows of grey blocks, built in a rush half a century ago, still housing millions. Inside, the same sounds drift through thin walls. A kettle boiling, a child crying, a television echoing 2 flats away. The Khrushchevka was supposed to solve the housing crisis. Instead, it left a permanent mark, a reminder that when you build for statistics instead of people, you don't build homes. You build slums with a state seal of approval.